Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. Chicago Public Schools invoke equity in their use of online classes, but research suggests online classes are far from equitable. Joining me to tell us more is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what is Chicago Public Schools' policy for online classes, and what role does equity play in it for them?
Yeah, I wrote about this because Chicago Public Schools last year, around this time, and in May, they adopted a policy that said we support virtual classes. And part of that resolution that the board adopted last year was about, it included a section on equity and basically said we're going to try to promote these virtual classes in the name of equity, and those students who need more help can get it through virtual classes, and allow flexibility to students. So they cited a lot of these different kinds of benefits, and they touted the equity side of that. And equity, when we are using it in like sort of this academic sense, maybe people don't know what it is. It's like if you're giving students, like helping everybody get to the same result, right? Of like helping people who maybe need more help getting special attention, right? And so that everybody has like the same outcome, right? Which is like a, well-rounded individual, or like the high school degree. So that's kind of, I think, it's good to kind of understand what people mean by equity, because I think sometimes that can get lost in the conversation. But that's what they were citing. But I've reported on this a little bit last year, quite extensively actually, about what the costs of online courses are, specifically credit recovery courses, but some of these like online course providers, as well as their vulnerability to cheating. So that was something that I talked a lot about last year. But the research that I've viewed and the researchers that I've talked to, they've said, this is essentially a lower quality education. Like this is a cheaper education option for schools to implement, because students don't have to go back in to the classroom if they fail a class with this online virtual credit recovery. And so it's a cheaper education, but it does have like sort of these like disparate impacts for those who are lower performing students. So essentially, students who are doing the worst are sent to a virtual class to try to catch up, but they don't learn as much there as they should, so they don't actually get caught up, right? And so they get a grade that is better than the one that they got initially, right? Like let's say you got an F in geometry and you're taking a virtual credit recovery course, and then you get a C, right? You're graduating on time, but the researchers found that actually will impact students after they graduate, like in the workforce. So like, let's say you go into the workforce, and that those who took these credit recovery courses, online credit recovery courses, they actually had lower wages, and it kind of followed them throughout. And so that's like an interesting thing about the data that researchers have looked at. And some of these were very large studies, right? Looking at the impact of these credit recovery courses, up to 7 million student records in one of the studies. So it's just an interesting kind of thing when you start talking about equity and you start invoking equity with these online courses. It starts to bring up questions of like, well, what is the best option for students? And then how do you mitigate some of those things while maybe getting some of those benefits, right? And so that's what I was curious about. And I reached out to Chicago Public Schools, and they didn't want to comment on it.
Was there any specific aspects that they were willing to speak to?
Yeah, I spoke to a spokesperson who said, this is that the policy narrowly applies to like the virtual academy, I believe. So like Chicago Public Schools has a virtual academy, which I believe has been around since 2021. This policy was adopted. It was an amendment to an existing policy, but it was adopted in 2023, so May of last year. And the policy before was like the internet policy, and I think it was back like to 2004. So like the internet was very different than it is now, and so they were amending it. And so there was the Chicago Public Schools. I mean, it's a very large school district, right? One of the largest in the nation. And the way that these amendments work is that I think that they're kind of made by the chief executive officer. So like they're given to the board to adopt, and then they're sort of adopted. I think they have like some opportunity for public comment. But it sort of mirrors some of those bureaucratic rules that you see from like the federal government as well. Like there's a public comment period, and then, they're sort of batch voted in. And that's the case last year in May, that there was like several different kinds of policies like this that were updated just sort of like with a blanket vote from the board. So that was what that's kind of how it got there. But the spokesperson said, this narrowly applies to that virtual charter school system. But the thing is with the policy is it does mention people who are on and off campus, right? And it's a broad promotion of these high school graduation courses taken through internet-based delivery. Like it doesn't kind of limit that to an academy in the document itself. So it's one of those questions of like, is that how the school is interpreting it? But based on the document itself, it seems pretty clear. And also other schools, right? There's schools in the district, public high schools in the district that offer virtual credit recovery, and they have that information on the website about how students can sign up for that and that kind of thing. So it does happen, right? And that's a common thing. And I've reported on this last year that virtual credit recovery is an increasingly popular option. I mean, like we had a lot of virtual learning during the pandemic, but this credit recovery option is a very good way for administrators to sort of get students graduated on time, right? And do that in a way that doesn't affect their class sizes, right? You have to think about how many students a teacher can take every year, right? And so for like that geometry class that I mentioned earlier, if somebody fails it the one year, they've got to go back the next year. Or they can take one of these virtual classes, and these virtual classes are much cheaper. And I think you can look at the master agreement, and it's like $85 or $165 per semester. So if you kind of factor in the costs, and one of the largest costs in education is the teachers, right? Is because you're paying the salary and the benefits, and so that is always one of the larger costs for a district is personnel and having people in who can teach. So this is kind of a way to mitigate that because you can teach a lot more students with fewer teachers through this online delivery, right? It's asynchronous. You don't have to be in the school building, or you can be monitored by. You can have one teacher monitoring 25 students in like a study hall situation, right? And that's what researchers have found is that, it is cheaper. But the researcher who I spoke to last year and whose research I referenced, right, they mentioned like some of the teachers saying there's no learning going on here. Like they'll have like a class of like 60 kids and they're all on their computers, but they're not getting anything, like they're not really learning, or some of them won't show up to class, or, there's different ways to cheat on some of these, or, there's people who have said students were going through their courses on these online courseware providers for credit recovery, that they're going through way too quickly for being able to do them themselves. They allege that they're copying and pasting answers from search engines. So if you look up the question, you can find the answer and then plug it in, and then you get an A or an A minus, that kind of thing. And you're taking like a 30-question math quiz, for example, in like 15 minutes. Like it's sort of like an impossible amount of a possibly short amount of time. And there's other sort of sophisticated methods to getting a good grade without having to do the work. I mean, you can go online and find somebody who will do your course, and you just slip them your credentials and pay them the money that they're asking for, and then you don't have to worry about this. And I think that there are ways to mitigate that with, having final exams proctored in class or like in person, and being very vigilant about that. But I mean, there's different kinds of workarounds, and cheating's not anything new. But I think it's one of those tough situations where maybe administrators or maybe schools are not fully aware of all the different kinds of new technologies that exist to help students with these kinds of courses, right? And then there's sort of like this quasi-legal black market almost of people who are saying, hey, I'll do your homework for you on social media. And so that's just like an interesting, point of view as well that I've written about. But it's a complicated kind of issue. But I think it does get back to like, what are kids learning? And it kind of gets into that equity question of like, what is good for kids? And, I think that there are some cases where students might do well in one of these online courses. But there's the research shows that, those who need the most help, when they're sent to these courses, they do not do well, and they do much worse than their peers who had in-person instruction and that sort of help in class.
Well, thank you for your insights on this story, Brendan. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Do you care about classroom curriculum, transparency policies, and how your taxpayer dollars are invested in education, but you find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? Chalkboard News is bringing you straight news reporting on public K-12 education. We're talking news without spin. Chalkboard News publishes fact-based stories that make sense to parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com. Subscribe today at chalkboardnews.com.